It began on a night when even the moon refused to show its face. The jungle was alive with the kind of silence that only comes before a storm, thick, oppressive, and waiting to break. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges of the Mariana Islands, 3,000 Japanese soldiers prepared for a final suicidal charge. Their boots sank into the mud, rifles clutched in trembling hands, the smell of sweat and steel mixing with the salt air. The officers whispered prayers to ancestors. The younger soldiers, barely more than boys, stared ahead into the darkness, pretending not to feel fear. They called it a Banzai charge, a final cry of defiance, the roar of the dying meant to shake the heavens. But what they didn't know was that on the other side of that jungle, behind a makeshift barricade of sandbags and scrap metal, a single man, not a soldier, not a Marine, but a civilian mechanic drafted into duty, waited with a weapon so small that even his comrades had laughed when they saw it. He wasn't supposed to be there. His name was Daniel Reeves, a wiry man from Kansas who had spent his life fixing tractors and radios, not firing guns. He had been stationed at a forward repair outpost, patching up broken equipment for the Marines when the word came down, "They're coming." Every able-bodied man was told to grab a weapon, any weapon, and prepare. Reeves grabbed what he had, a carbine modified for range testing, a prototype weapon the engineers had dismissed as too small for the field. It fired fast, accurate, and almost silently. But its caliber was small, so small that the other men joked he might as well throw rocks. Still, he loaded it, adjusted the sights, and settled in behind a rusted jeep that had been flipped for cover. The first screams came just after midnight, a chilling, rising wail that echoed through the palms and sent shivers crawling down spines. "Tenohaka Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" The cry of 3,000 voices cutting through the wind like a blade. Flares burst above the tree line, painting the jungle in fire. The ground shook beneath the stampede of boots. Marines on the front line opened fire, tracers streaking like red comets through the black. The air turned into chaos. Smoke, dirt, the metallic scent of blood, and the deafening thunder of machine guns. Yet for every Japanese soldier who fell, 2 more appeared, their bayonets glinting, their faces locked in a mixture of fury and despair. Reeves couldn't hear his own heartbeat anymore. The world was a blur of motion, shouting, explosions, the screams of men dying inches away. He saw a Marine beside him fall, chest torn open by a grenade. Another man was dragged backward, his arm shredded. The line was collapsing. Reeves clutched his toy gun, took a breath, and aimed into the darkness where shadows moved like waves. He squeezed the trigger. Pop, pop, pop. Each shot cracked like snapping twigs, small, unimpressive, almost laughable compared to the booming .30 calibers around him. But something strange happened. Each bullet found its mark. Each shadow that lunged forward fell still. He fired again and again, the rhythm steady, surgical. His world shrank to the iron sights and the dark shapes rushing toward him. When the first wave hit the barricade, it was madness. The Japanese came with bayonets fixed, some wielding swords, others just bare hands, screaming until their throats bled. Reeves shot until his weapon clicked dry, then reloaded without thinking, fingers moving like clockwork. The recoil was light, almost gentle, allowing him to stay on target, while others' heavier rifles kicked their aim skyward. One by one they fell. He wasn't even aware of time anymore, only the rhythm of fire, reload, fire. A grenade landed nearby, sending him sprawling, ears ringing, vision swimming. Through the haze, he saw one soldier charging him, face twisted with rage, bayonet raised. Reeves didn't think. He fired from the hip. The man dropped mid-stride, his weapon clattering beside him. Reeves stared in disbelief. The little gun had done it again. Hours passed like minutes. When the sun began to rise, the jungle was silent once more, except for the faint crackle of smoke and the soft groans of the wounded. The ground was littered with bodies, hundreds of them, their uniforms blending into the mud. Reeves sat there, covered in soot and blood, his weapon still warm. Around him, the few surviving Marines stared in stunned silence. They had expected to die that night. Instead, they had held the line. When they counted the dead later, The numbers didn't make sense. Over 2,500 enemy soldiers lay scattered across the ridge. On the American side, less than a dozen had fallen. It wasn't possible. But the proof was there, in the quiet, in the bodies, and in the tiny weapon that had refused to fail. That morning, a commanding officer approached Reeves, his face pale beneath his helmet. "What in God's name were you firing?" he asked. Reeves simply held up the carbine, scratched, smoking, impossibly small, and shrugged. Just what they said wouldn't work, but word traveled fast across the island. Stories spread of a civilian with a pocket rifle who had held off a Banzai charge that should have swallowed them whole. Some said it was luck, others said divine intervention, but those who had seen it with their own eyes knew the truth. It wasn't luck. It was precision, discipline, and a refusal to give up when the world demanded surrender. And as the next wave prepared to strike, somewhere deeper in the jungle, the Japanese commander would soon learn of the massacre that had shattered his last desperate hope. He would order his men forward again, not realizing that the smallest weapon on the field had already rewritten the outcome of their war. The morning haze clung to the trees like ghosts unwilling to leave. The air was heavy, filled with the metallic scent of blood and the faint, acrid bite of burnt powder. Daniel Reeves rubbed the soot from his eyes and felt the weight of silence press down harder than the gunfire ever had. Every sound, the drip of dew from a leaf, the distant crack of a branch, made his nerves twitch. He was still crouched behind the battered jeep that had saved his life, its metal pocked with shrapnel scars. When he finally looked up, the full scale of what he had survived came into focus. The jungle floor was carpeted with spent casings and the fallen forms of men who only hours earlier had been screaming into the darkness. It was victory, yes, but it was the kind of victory that didn't feel human. Reeves's fingers trembled as he reloaded out of instinct. The toy gun, as everyone called it, was streaked with mud but had never jammed once. Around him, the surviving Marines began to move, dazed, counting the living. A corpsman muttered a prayer under his breath while wrapping a comrade's arm. Another Marine sat with a blank stare, whispering, "They just kept coming." Reeves stood, his legs unsteady, and felt a strange mixture of disbelief and guilt. He hadn't thought about what those bullets meant. Each one a life erased, each shot cutting through the charge like a scythe through wheat. When the commanding officer arrived, the look on his face said everything. He'd seen battles end in chaos, but never one held by so few against so many. "Reeves," he said quietly, "you did what we didn't think possible." The mechanic-turned-sharpshooter didn't know how to answer. He simply nodded and stared at his weapon, the weapon that shouldn't have worked. The officer crouched, studying it. "What is this thing?" Reeves explained as best he could. A lightweight prototype developed by engineers for test ranges, firing small-caliber rounds with pinpoint accuracy. It was meant for training, not combat. "Guess it didn't get the memo," Reeves muttered. News spread across the island like wildfire. By the next day, pilots returning from sorties were already whispering about the Kansas marksman who had turned a hopeless defense into legend. Reporters wanted to know more, but Reeves had no interest in glory. He helped bury the dead, his hands shaking as he laid helmets over makeshift graves. That night, while others celebrated, he cleaned his rifle in silence, watching the moon rise through the trees. The laughter of men who'd cheated death drifted around him, yet he felt none of it. All he could think about was the sheer force of what had come at them, 3,000 men charging to die, and the single fact that his bullets had stopped them. Far away, in a Japanese command bunker cut deep into the hills, the news of the failure arrived like a hammer blow. The colonel in charge slammed his fist on the table, demanding explanations. Scouts spoke of invisible gunners, of lines that refused to break. "They were just a handful," the colonel shouted. But no one could explain how an entire regiment had been shredded by what seemed like minimal fire. "Then we attack again," he ordered grimly. He had no idea that the strange weapon in the hands of a civilian mechanic was already rewriting the tactical manuals of both sides. On the American carrier offshore, Engineers examined the recovered carbine, astonished by its simplicity. It weighed half as much as the standard issue rifle, yet delivered stable, rapid shots. "It shouldn't be this good," one muttered. "It's not designed for war." Another answered, "Maybe that's why it worked." They sent word back to the mainland. Test it, copy it, study every part. And so, what began as a single desperate stand by a man who didn't belong on a battlefield would ripple through research labs, eventually influencing entire generations of lightweight combat rifles. Back in the jungle, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, washing blood into the soil. Reeves tilted his head back, feeling it on his face. He had survived, but the victory felt hollow. The island was quiet now, yet every crack of thunder made him flinch. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. The other Marines called him lucky. He didn't correct them. Deep down, he knew luck had nothing to do with it. It was precision, discipline, and something deeper. The stubborn will to protect the man beside him, no matter how impossible the odds. That night, as the rain tapered off, Reeves sat under a tarp and scribbled a letter home. He didn't mention the bodies, or the screams, or the fact that he could still smell cordite in his hair. He wrote about fixing things, about keeping the engines running, about the stars above the Pacific. And then, without realizing it, he wrote one simple line that summed up the entire war for him. They said it was too small to matter, but out here, small things make all the difference. The dawn arrived like a silver blade cutting through the jungle canopy, the mist curling around the trees as if trying to hide the devastation below. Reeves stirred, feeling every ache from the previous day, his hands still smeared with mud and grime, the rifle at his side cold and heavy. He had never imagined that a weapon meant for testing could carry such power in the hands of someone desperate, someone who had to fight not for glory, but simply to survive. Around him, the island breathed, insects buzzing in the undergrowth, birds cautiously singing, and the faint rumble of distant waves against the shore. Yet beneath the serenity was an echo of yesterday's chaos, the thundering footsteps of a 3,000-man charge, the cries that had been swallowed by gunfire, the thunderous roar of small-caliber bullets tearing through the advancing line, halting a wave of fury that should have been unstoppable. Every Marine who had survived carried a story etched in flesh and bone. Every scar, every twitch, a testament to the near-impossible stand they had made. Reeves walked among them, checking faces, offering nods, silent reassurances, though he knew none could truly articulate the horror and awe of what had happened. He had stood on the precipice of annihilation and, with the too small weapon, turned it back into order, into survival, into a fleeting victory that felt both miraculous and surreal. The battlefield stretched endlessly behind them, broken branches, scorched earth, makeshift trenches, and countless fallen men, Japanese and American alike, all frozen in the cruel tableau of war. Yet through it all, Reeves's rifle had remained unyielding, each round precise, each trigger pull a lifeline for the men who followed. Far above, the sky was clear now, a serene contrast to the violence that had unfolded below. Reeves raised his eyes, noticing the way sunlight danced off the leaves, casting shadows that moved like silent specters. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he imagined waves of enemy soldiers regrouping, unaware of the force that had torn through their ranks. Somewhere else, strategists and engineers would soon study the aftermath, marveling at how a single, too small weapon had shifted the balance of a deadly encounter. The island itself seemed to hold its breath, recognizing the weight of that day, a day where ingenuity and courage had triumphed over sheer numbers. In the makeshift camp that evening, Reeves cleaned the rifle with meticulous care, tracing every scratch, every dent, knowing that it had earned its place in history. The other Marines watched him, some smiling weakly, some silent, each processing in their own way the improbable chain of events that had spared them. Stories began to circulate almost immediately, tales of how one man, armed with a weapon dismissed as trivial, had stopped what many thought was an unstoppable force. The legend grew with each retelling. 3,000 men had charged like waves against a single point. And yet, Like a rock in the ocean, Reeves and his small gun had shattered them, scattering the tide into nothing. As night fell, the jungle came alive with its nocturnal orchestra, insects chirping, leaves rustling, and distant roars of unseen predators echoing through the hills. Reeves sat silently, staring into the darkness, replaying the day in his mind. Each shot, each near miss, each fallen foe, they all seemed to blur together, forming a tapestry of chaos punctuated by the unmistakable rhythm of his rifle's fire. And yet, amid the carnage, there was an unspoken truth. Courage alone was insufficient. Technology, precision, and the willingness to act decisively, even when the world insisted it was too small to matter, were what turned the tide. In the following days, supply lines delivered reinforcements, and the battlefront slowly stabilized. Reports reached command. The Banzai charge had been stopped, its momentum shattered, its soldiers scattered. Analysts would later examine the after-action photos, counting bodies, noting trajectories, calculating the impossible odds overcome. In these dry official reports, the human element, the fear, the desperation, the sheer will to survive would be almost invisible. Yet for Reeves and his men, every detail was etched in memory. The smoke of spent cartridges hanging in the air, the cries of the advancing enemy, the flash of each round as it left the barrel and found its mark. Reeves finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of home, of family, of the life he had before the war, and felt a strange weight pressing on his chest. He had wielded a weapon deemed inconsequential, and in doing so had held back death itself. The island, scarred and silent, bore witness to that truth. It would remember long after the guns fell quiet and the soldiers returned to places far removed from this battlefield. And as Reeves gazed into the night sky, dotted with stars and veiled by the slow drift of clouds, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the smallest tools, guided by human resolve, could shape history itself, turning what seemed hopeless into victory. The sun had barely risen over the jagged cliffs of the island, casting a pale golden light across the scarred battlefield. Yet the air still smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and the faint acrid tang of burning wood and leaves. Reeves moved cautiously among the remnants of yesterday's chaos, each step revealing fragments of the confrontation. A broken bayonet, a torn uniform, spent shell casings glinting like tiny beacons of memory. Every Marine in the area carried a haunted expression, the kind only men who have stared down overwhelming odds can wear. And yet in their eyes was also a quiet pride, the recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary. For Reeves, the rifle at his side was no longer a mere weapon. It had become a symbol, an extension of human resolve against impossible forces, and its story would echo long after the battlefield fell silent. Around him, the landscape was both beautiful and terrifying, the jungle stretching endlessly, dotted with pools of water reflecting the sky. Trees twisted from cannon and bullet, and distant hills that still seemed to tremble from the shock waves of yesterday's charge. The morning air was filled with the hum of insects, but beneath that natural orchestra was an undercurrent of tension, the memory of enemy feet pounding across the terrain, the screams that had pierced the air, the sheer chaos of a 3,000-man wave meeting the immovable line of determined defenders armed with a weapon deemed too small. Reeves paused to watch a line of Marines methodically clear debris, ensuring that no traps, no hidden dangers remained to claim more lives. He felt the weight of responsibility, the same weight he had carried the day before as each pull of the trigger decided the fate of his comrades. He knew that history would record statistics, numbers, and strategies, but it could never capture the visceral reality of standing alone against an overwhelming tide, the adrenaline and fear coiling like living creatures inside the chest. Each man he passed offered a nod, a brief word, or a silent glance, acknowledging shared trauma and shared triumph. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the battlefield, Reeves and his small unit began documenting every detail: footprints frozen in mud, bullet trajectories across trees, the precise locations where men had fallen. Each observation was a testament to what had occurred, a silent declaration of how ingenuity and courage could redefine fate. Reeves reflected on the absurdity of it all, that a weapon small enough to be dismissed had turned a potential massacre into a moment of improbable victory. Every shot fired had been precise, calculated under stress, yet guided by instinct honed through desperation. The enemy's Banzai charge, a tidal wave of human determination and aggression, had collided with human will amplified by a singular tool, and the result had been miraculous. Beyond the battlefield, the island itself seemed to bear witness. Birds flitted cautiously between charred branches. The wind whispered through the undergrowth, and distant waves lapped against rocks, as if attempting to erase the horrors of the past day. Yet nothing could erase it. The lesson was etched into every tree, every footprint, every crater left by bullets and explosions. Size alone does not determine power, and numbers alone do not dictate the outcome of a battle. Reeves walked slowly, tracing the outline of a shallow trench where the enemy had been cut down, imagining the charge as it had swept forward like a living storm. The cries, the panic, the sudden halt caused by his single weapon's deadly precision. He marveled at the surreal symmetry of it all, how chaos had been transformed into order, how death had been turned aside by skill and resolve. By midday, reinforcements began arriving, and command officers took in the scene with measured surprise. Reports would later emphasize the strategic importance of what had occurred, analyzing formations, range, and firepower. But the true story, the human story, was already etched into the minds of every survivor. Reeves, walking among these men, felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet recognition that they had defied expectations, that they had rewritten a small portion of history on this island in a single moment of crisis. He checked his rifle carefully, cleaning the metal and inspecting the barrel, acknowledging that it had performed flawlessly under conditions that would have destroyed lesser weapons. Each scratch and dent told a story of life preserved, of threats neutralized, of a charge halted not by overwhelming force, but by determination and ingenuity. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the battlefield quieted. The sun reflected off spent shell casings and the occasional puddle of rainwater casting shimmering patterns across the terrain. Reeves paused, taking in the enormity of what had occurred. Thousands had charged with fury, yet few had survived. Yet here, on this scarred patch of earth, a handful of defenders had turned the tide. He realized, with a mixture of awe and exhaustion, that the smallest decisions, the smallest tools, wielded with skill and clarity, had the power to shape destinies. And somewhere deep within, he understood that the legacy of this day would not be measured in maps or reports, but in the lived memory of those who had faced the impossible and lived to tell the tale. As dusk approached, the sky painted in shades of crimson and gold. Reeves finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. The enemy had been defeated, the Banzai charge broken, and the island held. Yet beneath the triumph was an undercurrent of solemnity, the recognition of what had been risked, of lives spent, of courage tested in the crucible of combat. And in that quiet he understood the essence of warfare, that victory was never guaranteed, that even the smallest weapon, in the hands of the resolute, could alter the course of events. That history often hinged on moments of extraordinary human resolve. The morning mist clung to the jungle like a ghostly veil, softening the outlines of trees and the twisted remnants of yesterday's battlefield. Reeves stood at the edge of a small ridge, his weapon slung loosely across his back, and surveyed the scarred landscape below. What had unfolded here the day before was almost incomprehensible. A 3,000-man Banzai charge, a human tide of sheer ferocity, halted by a single civilian's too small weapon, each pull of the trigger shaping the fate of hundreds of lives in an instant. The air was eerily quiet now, save for the faint hum of insects and the distant lap of waves against rocky shores. But the silence itself was heavy, a living memory of the storm of gunfire and screams that had raged through these very trees. Shadows of mangled foliage and craters etched the story of the clash, a testament not just to the violence of war, but to the miraculous combination of courage, skill, and ingenuity that had turned a hopeless situation into a moment of improbable victory. Every Marine present had etched the events into memory, the overwhelming surge of enemy troops, the desperate cries for advancement, the sudden and precise bursts that shattered the momentum of a charge that should have swept everything in its path. Reeves retraced in his mind every second, how each calculated shot slowed the tide, how the weapon's limitations became a strength in the hands of someone who understood its potential, how strategy and instinct intertwined with the mechanics of metal and powder. The sheer audacity of what had been accomplished weighed on him. The odds had been insurmountable, yet through determination, presence of mind, and the clever application of a tool everyone had dismissed, the outcome had been rewritten. The Banzai charge, which had thundered toward annihilation, now lay broken, the advancing bodies reduced to scattered silhouettes against the rising sun, their spirit quelled not by force of numbers but by the unyielding will of a single individual. Reeves' gaze swept across the ridge and down into the valley, taking in the wreckage, spent shells glittering in pools of rainwater, uniforms shredded and mud-streaked, the ground pockmarked with footprints frozen in place, each telling a silent story of fear, valor, and desperation. He imagined the enemy's view, the realization dawning upon them as their seemingly unstoppable surge met resistance they could not overcome. The psychological shock, the collapse of morale in the face of precision and resolve, was as decisive as the physical barrier posed by the rifle's deadly accuracy. Even as reinforcements arrived and the survivors regrouped, the profound significance of the day resonated. The impossible had been accomplished, not by overwhelming might, but by clarity of purpose, courage, and deft application of the smallest yet most effective weapon. As the sun climbed higher, burning through the lingering mist, Reeves allowed himself a slow exhale. The battlefield was quiet now, the echoes of combat replaced by the natural sounds of life reclaiming the jungle. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, the steady pulse of wind across the ridges. Yet in that serenity lay the weight of memory, the enduring lesson that in war, scale and size are often deceptive, and that the human mind and spirit, guided by precision and courage, can turn even the smallest instrument into a force of monumental consequence. Every step forward across this scarred land was a reminder of what had been survived, what had been learned, and what would be remembered forever. Reeves walked among his comrades, sharing brief nods and solemn acknowledgments. Each man understood that history would note numbers and statistics, but the true narrative, the human story, lived in their hearts and in the very soil beneath their boots. The charge had been stopped, the island held, and a lesson had been etched permanently into the annals of combat. That ingenuity, bravery, and calculated action can transform the outcome of seemingly impossible situations. The civilians' too small weapon had not merely halted a tide of humanity, it had reshaped the story of survival, courage, and the power of a single decisive act. As dusk fell, painting the sky in deep reds and purples, Reeves paused one last time to survey the island. The mist had lifted, revealing the scars of battle with stark clarity. In the quiet, he could almost hear the ghostly echoes of the charge, the muted roar of men surging forward, and the precise, controlled reports that had shattered their momentum. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, and Reeves whispered to himself, "This is the power of resolve. The triumph of the unseen and underestimated. The victory of the human spirit against impossible odds." The jungle seemed to hold its breath in acknowledgement, and the day ended not with fanfare but with a profound, unspoken understanding that history is written not only by armies and strategies, but by the courage, skill, and determination of those who rise when all seems lost. The sun rose blood-red over the jungle ridge, casting long shadows across the trembling earth as 3,000 Japanese soldiers surged forward in a seemingly unstoppable tide, their voices a single monstrous roar echoing through the morning mist. Amid the chaos, one lone civilian stood, barely noticeable, a weapon no larger than a child's imagination gripped in his hands. Yet in that moment, It seemed to contain the concentrated wrath of the heavens themselves. Time slowed. The distant shouts and pounding boots became a background hum, replaced by the singular rhythm of his heartbeat and the sharp metallic crack of his first shots. Each round tore through the advancing wave with surgical precision, bullets cutting down warriors whose momentum had made them believe they were invincible, faces frozen mid-scream, bodies sprawling as if gravity itself had betrayed them. Smoke from his weapon drifted lazily into the sun, curling around his calm figure while chaos reigned from above. A ballet of carnage and precision where the impossible became reality. Soldiers who had charged with blind courage now collided with one another, tripping, tumbling, their once proud banners collapsing into the churned mud. The jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. Leaves and vines rattled under the shockwave of sudden destruction, while birds took flight, screaming, their wings reflecting the morning light like streaks of fire across the sky. With every shot, the sheer audacity of the act became legend. The Banzai tide, meant to overwhelm, shattered into fragments of panic and disbelief, each man realizing too late that numbers alone could not conquer courage combined with precision. By midday, the ridge was eerily silent, smoke twisting from the ruined line of attackers, the sun casting golden beams through mist and debris, illuminating the lone figure of the civilian as he lowered his weapon, his chest heaving, sweat and blood mixing yet unbowed. Around him, the battlefield bore testimony. Mangled weapons, broken helmets, the earth churned from hundreds of desperate charges now rendered meaningless. And in the hearts of survivors, an indelible terror had taken root. The idea that one individual, wielding what the world deemed too small, could halt an entire army, rewriting the laws of combat in that fateful morning. His hands still trembled from the strain of every calculated breath. Yet the air around him seemed almost reverent, as though the jungle itself recognized the impossibility that had just occurred. And in that suspended moment, with the sun high and smoke rising, history paused. A single civilian, a weapon deemed insignificant, and the overwhelming force of a 3,000-man charge reduced to nothing more than legend, forever etched into memory. The echoes of the charge, the shattered cries, and the quiet triumph of one against thousands lingered long after the last shot faded, leaving behind an image seared into imagination, the small man who stopped an army, a story of courage so improbable it defied reason yet unfolded in full, terrifying clarity on that blood-stained ridge.